What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Points Per Podcast. Thank you for joining us as always. Today, we're going to talk about 6 teams that we think will help you win your fantasy leagues this year in 2025. And to help me talk about that today, I'm going to bring on my co-hosts here. We got Will and we got Vishy. How you guys doing tonight? Will, we'll start with you.
I'm feeling great. I'm actually really excited to talk about these players, talk about these situations tonight.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm ready to get into it. How about you, Vishy?
I'm excited. I was watching some film. By film, I mean how I did the last time I was on the pod. So we got some improvements ready to go. Let's get into it.
Love to hear that. We're working on ourselves for you, the audience.
What's going on, guys? Will here in post. I just wanted to mention, because we forgot to in this video, that when we selected the teams for this video, we wanted to make certain exclusions just to leave the no-brainers out of there. So we excluded teams with 2 players in the top 24, and we also excluded teams with 3 players in the top 36. So I'm going to list those off as follows. So expect to not see players from these teams in this video. First off, we have the Cincinnati Bengals, then the Detroit Lions, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Los Angeles Rams, the Atlanta Falcons, the Las Vegas Raiders, and the Miami Dolphins. So like I said, expect to not hear players from those teams. Again, sorry if this caused any confusion. Back to the video.
So let's get this thing started. I'm going to be a little selfish here as the host. I want to start with probably my favorite offense to invest in fantasy this year. And that's going to be the Jacksonville Jaguars. There we go. There's the graphic. So let me pull up my notes here. I am going to talk for kind of a while about this. Apologies in advance, but I have a lot of positive notes to get through. So team situation is probably what people expect me to talk about the most with Liam Cohen coming to town. And I am going to go through all the details of why that's going to raise the floors and the ceilings of everybody in this offense. But when you truly take a stand on players and like advocate to take them way above ADP, you really have to have those guys be very talented individuals. And so 2 players that I'm more bullish on than probably nearly anybody in fantasy right now are Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter. So before we get to those situational improvements, I just kind of want to talk about why those guys are individually as awesome as they are. So Brian Thomas Jr., obviously ridiculous athlete for his size, and last year he posted elite production and efficiency. He had 284 PPR points per game last year. That was 4th most for a rookie since 2010, behind only Odell, Puka, and Jamar Chase. He was also one of 4 wide receivers aged 22 or younger that averaged a half PPR point per game or per route run since 2013. The only others to do that: Odell again, Chase again, and Justin Jefferson. He absolutely alphaed everyone in that offense last year and demanded a ridiculous amount of volume while he was on the field. He commanded 41% of the total team receiving yards and 59% of the total team receiving touchdowns. Those are both better rates than the career best numbers for guys like Randy Moss, Calvin Johnson, Antonio Brown, Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams, and DeAndre Hopkins. Like, we're talking truly rarefied air with BTJ. And then we get to Travis Hunter. He was the first player ever to win both the Bednarik, the Defensive Player of the Year, and the Biletnikoff, the Best Receiver of the Year in college football, in the same year last year. Truly one-of-one athlete and football player. He might have like the best ball skills and ball tracking that I've ever seen. He graded out in my wide receiver model as the best in this class by a significant margin, earned that top spot even with terrible usage at Colorado. They limited him to like 4 routes. And so the fact that he was able to put up those kind of numbers is ridiculous. And I think his film was also otherworldly. And so I don't think he'll have any problem growing his route tree given the proper coaching and opportunity. So just wanted to take a second to highlight those guys specifically. But when it comes to Liam Cohen, these are the things I want to get into. In 2024 for the Jags under Doug Peterson and Press Taylor, they were 18th in EPA per play, 21st in EPA per pass, 24th in both passing yards and completion percentage, and 28th in passing touchdowns. Under Cohen in 2024, the Bucs in all of those same categories were 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 2nd. So top 5 literally across the board. When it comes to their receivers, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin both set career bests in yards per route run last year under Liam Cohen. Talking about guys that are decorated veterans in the game, guys that are incredibly talented with outstanding careers. and still were able to put up the most efficient seasons that they've ever had in this offense. Side note to that, BTJ had a higher yards per route run rate than both of them last year as a rookie on a terrible Jags offense. The slot role in particular in Liam Cohen offenses is crazy coveted, dating back to the Cooper Kupp days in LA. But last year specifically, Chris Godwin produced 14 points per game from slot snaps alone. It was, hold on, I have it right here. So slot snaps only accounted for 60% of Godwin's total route share. So on 60% snaps, he was putting up 14 points per game. That's going to be a role that's good for both BTJ and for Travis Hunter, but especially for Hunter, who lined up in the slot over 60% of the time in the preseason. So if people are worried about Hunter having limited snap share, this is a stat that you can point to tell you why it's going to be just fine. Cohen also had both Evans and Godwin run slants at or above a 75th percentile frequency last year. Slants are one of the most efficient fantasy producing routes for wide receivers. Another side note, BTJ led all receivers in average separation score when running slants last year, but the Jags coaching staff only had him run them at an 18th percentile rate. So if we get him up into that same category as the wide receivers last year, he's going to absolutely smash. So those are all great things for receivers. I fully expect Cohen to crush it when it comes to the quarterback position as well. Baker Mayfield took a jump. If you guys watched our last video about players that we were fading, I talked about Baker's career highs under Liam Cohen. In terms of fantasy points per game, going from 17.1 to 21.5, passing touchdowns from 28 to 41. He nearly doubled his rushing points per game output from 2 to 3.3. And I already mentioned the efficiency of the offense overall in the passing categories. All reasons why you should be buying in on Trevor Lawrence, considering he's QB 19 right now. I think if he takes that Baker Mayfield jump, then we're talking about a huge value in drafts. And then the last thing here, Cohen brings with him a very efficient and productive rushing attack. The Bucs were 6th in EPA per rush, 3rd in success rate, 4th in rush yards last year. I'll acknowledge the Jags offensive line is significantly worse than what we saw in Tampa Bay last year, and they probably don't have a Bucky Irving level talent in that backfield. But I do think that Bashal Tutin is one of the most explosive backs in the 2025 class. And I think that Etienne and Bigsby both have things in their games that are significantly better than what Rashad White was able to bring to the table last year. So I think the potential is still there for that running back room. And it's a room that I want to leave drafts with at least one piece of nearly every time. And then the very last thing to put the cherry on top, the Jags have the 6th easiest strength of schedule this year and are projected by the Ringer to have the dead last defense in the league. So that's going to mean a lot of shootouts, but probably not a lot of blowouts. So games are going to stay competitive and allow for all of the position groups to eat. Apologies for the crazy yap sesh, but I think the Jacksonville Jaguars are maybe the best team to target in fantasy right now.
I absolutely agree. I think that, I love this ascending, Jaguars team. I love Liam Cohen. We're going to get into him a little bit of a spoiler a little bit later too. But with Liam Cohen, with this offense, I'm really excited about where they're going forward. I feel like this is the first year they're actually being challenged to actually, like you said, develop something. Because last year, it was a lot of BTJ finding success within chaos. And this year, there's going to be a lot more structure, a lot more flow to offense, a lot more getting your guys out there and in rhythm. So I'm excited to see what they can actually get done with a little bit of cohesion to their offense.
100%. Dog thinks so too.
Absolutely.
Vishy, anything to add before we move on to the next one here?
Not much. I agree. And I think there's evidence of why your takes are, at least in my opinion, spot on. I think the ADPs for all these folks, maybe with the exception of BTJ, has been steadily climbing, I think, since, mocks started happening in like June after the rookie draft, after the NFL draft. I think that's only evidence. Honestly, I kind of wish people would stop talking about Travis Hunter and Bashal Tutin. I want those guys. I think it'll be exciting. And I don't really mind that they have a poor defense. I think the shootouts are going to be really fun to watch.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think they'll be beneficial. But let's move on to the second team here. Will, we're going to go to you next. Which team do you want to say is going to be a league winner for players this year?
Absolutely. The team that I'm going with is actually going to be Liam Cohen's old team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
There we go.
Now, with that being said, I want it to be known that I do know Liam Cohen being gone is going to affect this offense in some way, shape, form, or fashion. there's probably going to be some form of regression in terms of the negative direction as opposed to the positive, because they were able to put some record-breaking career stuff together last year with this offense, specifically with Baker Mayfield and what he was able to do in the passing game. Now, bringing in Josh Grizzard last year, he was the passing game coordinator. So having him as the OC, still expect some level of cohesion to this offense and a certain level of at least consistency there. But obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same. There's going to be some differences to this offense that we still need to see exactly what they shake out to be. But with that being said, guys like Mike Evans, his usage hasn't slowed down really at all with this team. And the team has even made it a point that they will force the ball to him just to make sure he does get these 1,000-yard seasons. But with that being said, he's also scored double-digit touchdowns in 4 of the last 5 seasons. And even last year, he was the wide receiver 10 in points per game. So in terms of how he's doing in fantasy usage, he's still been a great asset that could be found in the 3rd round of drafts that could still provide possible wide receiver 1 usage in the games that you get out of him throughout the season. Even though last year he played 14 games last year, so he didn't play through the whole season. We'll get into that later though. Emeka Egbuka is rising up boards fast as time is going along, as we get closer and closer to the season, but he still hasn't hit a price yet that I haven't found attractive. I think as of right now, he's like not the wide receiver 85. He's the 85th overall player in fantasy. So he's going somewhere in like the 8th round, somewhere like the 7-8 turn, which I don't think is really a bad price for a guy who is going to get a lot of burn early on in the season. With Chris Godwin being out of the offense, with Jalen McMillan also being out of this offense, they're going to be looking for guys out there. And with the rapport he's already been able to build with Baker Mayfield in the offseason, I think we're primed for an Emeka Egbuka sort of breakout already. I think this team, he's going to hit the ground running, and he's going to be a part of this offense extremely early on. Cade Otton last year was a crazy value. He finished at the tight end 11 in points per game, and currently right now in drafts, he's going as the tight end 23, probably not going drafted in a lot of drafts. I'm not saying you should go out there and get Cade Otton and that he should be on your team, but I will say don't be surprised if he is on those waiver wire articles come week 1 when this team is still figuring out where all the targets are going to, and he ends up being one of those guys early on. And also with Chris Godwin himself, I think that with the injury stuff, obviously he's not as attractive, but he has been slipping further and further down boards. And with that being said, when he does get back here on the field, there is going to be a role for him in this offense. Obviously, they extended him. He's got the money. He's going to get the role back, not from Emeka Egbuka totally, I don't think, but he's still going to have a role within this offense, especially with Jalen McMillan being out for the season. I think he just slots right back into that wide receiver 2-3 mix. And like I alluded to earlier, with Mike Evans only playing 14 games, there may be some weeks where it is just Chris Godwin and Emeka Egbuka, as the wide receiver duo out there for Tampa Bay. And obviously, this all goes without mentioning Bucky Irving in the backfield and Rachaad White, who's still going to be not a sneaky value, but one of those guys who, if your team is hurting for players towards the end of the season, he may be a guy who is getting points for your team because he's still catching balls out the backfield for this team. And he's still getting those kind of valuable reps. So I wouldn't be surprised about situations like that. But I definitely do think that Chris Godwin, the further we get to the season, the closer we get to the season, the more of a value he's becoming. And I think the only thing that would really be scaring me off from him is if I thought Tez Johnson was somehow going to take the role from him. And with all the preseason hype, I don't think that's a possibility.
Yeah, I love a lot of what you said. It seems like they're preaching continuity down there. And so if we can see anything remotely close to what they did last year, we could be in for more fantasy fireworks. Vishy, what's your opinion here?
I completely agree. And I think the Godwin take is interesting. I think, people have only been starting to fade him because of the injury concerns, but I think it's a practical take. And if your league has like IR spots like most do, why not stash him and see what happens midseason?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially if he ends up, falling dramatically, which I could definitely see happening with all of these injury concerns. I think Cade Otton was a great shout for deeper leagues. I think Egbuka, this is something I want to mention because we have the ADPs up here on the graphic. It's combined with Underdog versus Yahoo. With Emeka Egbuka specifically, there's a huge gap between those two. He's going way earlier on Underdog. So just make sure you're checking the app that you're drafting on and the ADPs for those specifically. But yeah, fully agree. A lot of these guys look like great values right now.
I'd also like to note the team decided to pay him after they got that terrible bill of health that we all know that Chris Godwin got at this point too. So
That's very true.
yeah, just to add that as well.
Yeah, definitely. All right, let's move on to team number 3. Vishy, we'll go to you next. Who do you want to bring up here?
I'm going to go to a team that I think Liam Cohen's never touched. Might be wrong. But yeah, so when we talk about teams that you want to leave drafts with at least a player from or players that are undervalued, San Francisco was a no-brainer for me. Dude, sick graphic. The situation over there, chaotic for sure. They got receivers dropping like flies even as of like a day or two ago. This is being filmed on Monday, 25th. And then they just made a blockbuster trade for Sky Moore, who I forgot was even in the league. But I think that actually lets us capitalize on the guys that actually aren't hurt. I mean, we talk about continuity, and then they're the ones that are going to be continuing to get reps in this offense. And also, before I start, I want to note that their early season schedule is great. I think they play like the Saints and Cardinals in the first couple weeks, and so even if you're worried about the health, probably rightfully so, about the guys I'm about to yap about. Maybe you could trade them after a couple weeks. I still think they're good investments. So let's start with CMC. A couple years ago, he broke fantasy. We all know that, unless this is your first year playing in fantasy, in which case just draft him. Don't think twice. And then last year he got hurt again, and there's definitely injury concerns. If you couldn't say he was injury prone before, you definitely can now. But like, we don't play fantasy to not lose, and taking a guy like ADP 7 through 10 or so, depending on your platform, that basically has RB1 upside when healthy, like that's at least worth considering. And then, if we play the argument out that, okay, he stays healthy, but he's a year removed and he doesn't return to that 2023 form, maybe you think he's a little washed. The volume he's going to get is still there. Even with the Brian Robinson signing, it's still there. And so a first round return on value is more than likely if he stays healthy. Long story short, I think he's healthy, and he's really good at football. And then we can move on to George Kittle. Kittle was the best tight end last year, I think, by points per game. And then all we've seen since then is the departure of guys like Debo and injuries to Brandon Ayuk and Juwan Jennings, both of which I think are good receivers and possibly good later round picks. And Kittle's cost is high. Actually, all three of the guys I'm going to talk about, CMC, Kittle, and Ricky P, they are expensive. They're not cheap. And so you have to draft him in that tier along with Brock Bowers and Trey McBride. But when he's healthy, he has a rapport with Brock Purdy, and I think he's the overall tight end 1 candidate with a high floor. And his upside's also high. I think he had the second highest red zone target share last year among all tight ends. And there's no reason to believe that won't change, and that's just going to push his upside further higher. And so I think with his ADP in like the late 3rd or early 4th, if he's there at a pick in the 4th round, really at any point, I think that's just a smash. And then finally, Ricky Pearsall. I think a lot of the same volume arguments can be made with him as I did with Kittle. There's not actually that many mouths to feed on that offense. We say this, but again, there's a lot of guys that are hurt, and Ricky P ended the year last year, I think, really well. I think it was a couple touchdowns and over 200 yards in the last couple of games. So ultimately, he's an athletic first-round pick. He doesn't have that much competition, at least in the wide receiver room. And so if you're in the mid-rounds and you miss out on guys in his tier like Rome or a Mecca or a couple other guys that are in that range, I think he's a great get. I don't think you're going to regret it, especially early on in the season. And then lastly, I was going to talk about Purdy, and then I realized the ADP has really been slowly climbing to the point where it might be a little too rich for me. So I'm not going to preach him maybe like I planned. I think he's a perfectly fine QB if you miss out on the top 4 or 5 grouping, depending on how good you think Joe Burrow is at football. But Purdy has shown the ability to perform well. I think he actually offers a decent rushing floor. He had like 5 or 6 touchdowns last year rushing, a couple hundred yards. But now that he's being drafted as a top 12 QB, I think I'm not as interested, given how similar he is to, in my opinion, like the next 5 to 6 QBs or so. But to close, I think the 49ers receiving room as a whole is pretty murky. But I think that just means there's value to capitalize there. So I really like Kittle and Pearsall, even at cost, even though it's pretty high when they're being drafted all in the first 5 to 6 rounds.
Yeah, I love that. I think this is a team that I would have wanted to put on my list if we were to go a little bit deeper. And I agree with all of the takes that you had. Will, do you have anything to add?
I completely agree. I think at the end of the day, when it comes to offense, you can't really bet against Shanahan. I think they're always going to find a way. And when it comes to the 49ers, they usually do find a way no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah, and just specifically, like you mentioned, McCaffrey, easily RB1 upside. He's shown that, but being drafted at the end of the first. George Kittle just finished as the tight end one last year, being drafted in the third, fourth. Pearsall, you mentioned the upside. Juwan Jennings, I think even with the Ayuk injury, can still find volume. And you said Purdy climbing in ADP, and I agree that the quarterbacks are pretty flat in that range. But like, especially in super flex leagues where you have to get your guys, I think that Brock Purdy is still a good value where he goes.
I completely agree.
All right. I like that a lot. Let's move on to the fourth team that we have here. I'm back up. I'm going to talk about the Dallas Cowboys. My argument here, I think the Cowboys are going to be this year's Bengals. In terms of like things that they have in common, let's start with terrible defense because that's unquestioned. They're currently projected to be 21st in the league in team defense, and that's assuming that they have Micah Parsons. Who knows what's going to happen with that situation? I do probably put my money that he will be on the field come week one, but if not, that ranking is going to drop dramatically. And also, their top two DPs are still working their way back from injury. So I think that 21st ranking is a pretty fragile one. This team's just going to be in a ton of shootouts, which leads to great offensive environments for specifically the guys I have highlighted, the quarterback and the receivers. Another thing they share in common with the Bengals, in my opinion, an elite wide receiver room. CeeDee Lamb is a consensus top 5 wide receiver in this league. He put up over 400 fantasy points en route to a wide receiver 1 finish in 2023 and still managed to finish as the wide receiver 8 last year, despite losing Dak early in the season and battling through some injuries of his own. I think George Pickens, as an addition to this team, I think he's a perfect fit. First, I think he's just better than most people give him credit for. He finished last year with a 2.28 yards per route run, just behind Malik Neighbors. He finished with a targets per route run rate of 0.26, which was tied with Jamar Chase. And not only that, but like Dak hasn't had a true boundary ball winning receiver to throw to since Dez Bryant. And I think that's a really key role for this offense that could unlock both Pickens individually and some of Dak's fantasy upside as well. I'm not going to say that Dak is in the same league as Joe Burrow, but I think they're both very good pocket passing quarterbacks, and they're both capable of facilitating high-end fantasy production for an offense. Dak showed that in 4 seasons throughout his career, while he finished with over 20 fantasy points per game, doing so most recently in 2023. Obviously, last year was derailed due to injury, but he's back healthy again, and I have no reason to doubt his talent and ability. And then the last thing here, a coach that's willing to throw the ball a ton if necessary, I think is very important to make this comparison. And I think that Brian Schottenheimer is that coach. Some people might not agree. There's kind of some indecision about his schematics and like how he goes about an offense. But he was the offensive coordinator for the Cowboys in 2023 when Dak finished as the QB3 and CeeDee as the wide receiver 1. He was also the OC in Seattle from 2018 to 2020 and helped Russell Wilson have some of the best passing numbers of his career there. And I think the reason that Pete Carroll fired him after that 2020 season was due to a difference in opinion about the direction of the offense. Basically, Brian Schottenheimer wanted to throw too much and Pete Carroll wanted to establish it. And so he said, "You're out of here." But like I said, he has that track record with the Cowboys already. So there's some of that consistency and some of that continuity. We're going to see another high-flying passing attack there. So it's hard to push CeeDee's ADP any higher than it already is, considering he's ranked as the wide receiver 2 and going, what do I have, 4.6 here? So right there in the middle of the first round. But I wouldn't be mad at anybody for taking him as high as number 2 overall, especially if we're talking full PPR. But even in half PPR, I could defend it. And then I just think George Pickens is one of the best values in all of fantasy, even considering his ADP has consistently been rising throughout the offseason. I just don't see a huge projectable difference between him and T. Higgins, and they still go almost 2 rounds apart. I didn't really touch on the running backs. We just heard that Jaden Blue has a low ankle sprain, and I don't think that there's a ton of talent in that room in general. I think it's going to be kind of an ugly, gross committee. And even guys like Kevontae Turpin, the wide receiver, could kind of work in for some carries and gadget touches, receptions out of the backfield. So I'm not specifically targeting any of the running backs. Jaden Blue's probably the highest upside of the bunch because he does have that receiving background. But the guys that I really want to highlight that are my favorites are obviously going to be CD, Pickens, and Prescott. What do you guys think about that?
I absolutely agree. I think that what you touched on last was probably one of the more important parts too, is that running back room really stinks. So it's going to be tough for this team to ever really establish the run. So they're going to have to throw the ball a lot. And with that being said, I also think that their defense, they're not very good. They weren't very good last year. I don't think that really all they got back this year was Trayvon Diggs. And right now, they don't have Micah Parsons. They may not have Micah Parsons going into the season. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for this offense because they're going to end up in a lot of shootouts with a lot of good teams. As for the bad teams, maybe they end up steamrolling over them because, again, this offense is really good. And then once they get rolling, they could really get rolling for this passing attack. But otherwise, I think that this is more of an opportunity for this passing offense to really, really get going as opposed to, like you said, the running back room just isn't much to shake a stick at.
Absolutely. Bishy, do you agree?
Yeah, as an unbiased fan who has Dak on his dynasty team, I think this one's going to be fun to watch. I do agree with you, Bengals take. I think this could be a team where they both finish as wide receiver ones or very close to that. Not only is it in their range of outcomes, but I mean, you made a pretty well reasoned argument that it's hard to imagine where we're not at least close to that, unless they're just a historically bad team, in which case, yeah, CD and Pickens aren't going to do anything, but actually they still might do something. I think it's going to be fun to watch, and I think it's a reasonable bet to bet on them both high, and I think Pickens in the fifth, like I could a fourth isn't horrible or unjustifiable for him for sure.
Completely agree with all of that. Will, let's move on to the fifth team here. Who's it going to be up for you?
The fifth team that we're going to be talking about here is going to be the Minnesota Vikings. Now, let's talk about this because this is one of the weirder situations for me because last year the Minnesota Vikings were incredible. Yes, Flynn, I know. Last year the Minnesota Vikings were absolutely incredible. They had the most yards of total offense in the NFL, and they went 14-3 with Sam Darnold at the helm. Now, what that really showed us, did that mean Sam Darnold was elite? We'll find out this year with the Seattle Seahawks. But what that really did show us is that Kevin O'Connell is an amazing coach and was able to turn what people thought was going to be a really bad situation into a really, really good situation. Now, playoffs aside, when it came to the fantasy football season, everything kind of went extremely well for this team. Now, outside of Justin Jefferson, because his price seems to be coming down lower and lower as we get closer to the season for some reason. Like right now, he's at the sixth overall, seventh overall range, which I think is a little bit ridiculous. But hey, I'm willing to take a shot on Justin Jefferson. I don't think quarterbacks have ever really affected him ever. But for some reason, people think that this is going to, but I digress. Jordan Addison last year, if he would have played all 17 games, it would have extrapolated to 71.5 receptions, almost 1,000 yards, and 10 touchdowns. And last year, he was the number 10 receiver in the NFL in red zone targets with 18, 16 of which he reeled in. So they're consistently always looking at him in the red zone. So in reality, he finishes the wide receiver 22 in points per game, but he's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 41. A lot of this is due to, the suspension driving his price down. But with that being said, he was the wide receiver 22 in points per game. We're drafting him as the wide receiver 41, and he didn't play 2 games last year. He's only got 1 extra game this year. If you really think about it like that, you're only missing 1 extra game there. So the price, it's being driven down a little bit too far. And that's when we're talking about a relied upon receiver and a pass happy offense with one of the greatest offensive minds in the NFL as their head coach. With that also being said, TJ Hawkinson should now be fully recovered from his knee injury, and I think he's going to rebound pretty big this year. I think he's going to find his footing pretty early in the season with the Jordan Addison suspension and with that increased target share and red zone looks possibly, since, most of them won't be going towards Jordan Addison because they love throwing it to him in the red zone. And with that also being said, with JJ McCarthy under center, the running backs are also going to be leaned on a little bit more in this instance, I feel like. But that's not going to matter because teams can't stack the box against them. Because if they do, you're going to absolutely pay for it. The team is just way too talented everywhere else, and Kevin O'Connell is too good at drawing things up to be able to strike when you do that. And with that also being said, they added Jordan Mason to this running back room, which just made it that much better. Last year, they relied heavily on Aaron Jones, and as the season went on, he started to break down, and that started to wear on the team. The team was still successful, but they weren't as successful as they were early in the season when Aaron Jones was fresh and was able to attack every week in and week out. With Jordan Mason there, able to keep this team fresh, I think that's just going to be amazing. I think both players are going to have their own standalone value due to the roles they're going to have in this offense. Because one, I think the team's going to be successful. So Jordan Mason in that sort of goal line role is going to be successful. But also Aaron Jones out of the backfield with JJ McCarthy most likely checking down the ball a lot to him is also going to be successful. But with that being said, if either one of them were to go down, they both have workhorse value at the same time. So it's just a good investment for two guys who are going way later than they probably should be in drafts. So at this point, for this offense to fail and for pretty much all of these players to not be gigantic values, you're counting on JJ McCarthy being a total zero in this offense. And I don't see that happening outside of catastrophe because this team has done nothing but indicate the opposite.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Vishy, I want to hear your thoughts before I kind of give mine.
Sure. Yeah, I think I want to focus on the running back takes. I know they're not highlighted here, but I think it's important to talk about. And I completely agree. I think sometimes I preach, and I think in the last pod I might have mentioned this about the discussion of are handcuffs worth it for your own players or not. And I think this is a clear-cut case where Mason, I suppose you could call the RB2 here, even though it's really just a difference of one. They're next to each other in ADP. Mm-hmm. But he's not really a handcuff because he does have standalone value. He's going to get a really decent, if not the majority of the rushing shares even. And then, like you said, if Aaron Jones goes down, Jordan Mason is now a massive value. They're getting in, the 8th or 9th round. So completely agree.
Yeah, I love that. I think I agree with both of you guys on this. Just to kind of play devil's advocate with the amount of talent that they have in all facets, it's just a ton of mouths to feed. And, we are talking about not a rookie quarterback, but a guy that hasn't seen the field yet. I tend to be on the side that McCarthy is very talented. I trust KOC with my life. And so I think that he's probably at least what Sam Darnold was last year, if not better. And so I think that he will kind of raise the tide for everybody and allow there to be fantasy production there. But there is a chance that maybe they try to be more run heavy, which would benefit the running backs, but take away some of that volume from the receivers. I still think they're going to be incredibly efficient because, like you said, defenses are going to have to be honest to everybody. But just, kind of devil's advocate in terms of volume, I think there could be concerns there. But anything more to say on that, Will?
Nah, that's it. I think we covered it all right there.
Nice. Yeah, I'm highly in favor of drafting Minnesota Vikings this year. Vishy, we're going to round it out with you. Give us our 6th team that's going to win people leagues this year.
Will do. So my 49ers picks that I mentioned earlier, they're obviously like early to mid rounders. I still do think they offer a good value this season. But to flip the script, I want to talk about some of the later round picks with the Bears that could offer, I think, great value in the second half of your draft. Hey, where drafts can be won. So first, I want to bring up the reason, really one of the only reasons for optimism with this Bears team, and that's their new head coach, Ben Johnson. He called the league's best offense last year with the Lions. He set a bunch of records, I think one of which was like one of the highest scoring offenses in NFL history, something like the 10th best ever in points per game, and the best in Bears history at least. And more importantly, it was the first team ever, I think in history, to have 4 players with 1,000 yards from scrimmage. And so when I talk about guys that aren't at the top of the depth chart here, there's hope because they're talented. The receiving room is a little ambiguous, and Ben Johnson helps multiple players, including those not at the top of the depth chart, be fantasy relevant. And so before I get to some of the pass catchers, we can talk about Caleb Williams first. He's being drafted outside the QB1 range, I believe, and yep, that checks out as per the ADP there. And that's because he had a pretty mid-year last year. He took a ton of sacks, which I don't want to get into, and bottom half of the league in a lot of QB metrics like passing yards per attempt, completion percentage over expected, and so on. But he was a rookie, and since then he's gotten upgrades to the coaching staff, The weapons around him are much better now. I think they added a few. And he does have rushing upside, which is something that is valuable in QBs, at least in fantasy. And I think that rushing upside hasn't fully matured yet because I don't think he had rushing touchdowns last year, and that only brings up his fantasy numbers and fantasy totals game over game, week by week. So given his price, which is outside the top 10 or 12 QBs, I think he's a great get. Again, if you miss out on the top tier of QBs, the big 4, maybe 5, I think he's a phenomenal get that you can kind of keep your eye on and wait for. He's being drafted at QB 14, and I personally think that a QB1 finish, top 12 QB finish, is not only in his range of outcomes, but actually rather likely, especially with Johnson in his ear. Moving on to Colston Loveland. I think I talked about him in the last pod too. Yes, he's currently listed behind Cole Kmet in the depth chart. Yes, he's a rookie in what we consider a crowded receiving room, but he's very talented, as we saw in the preseason. And if Ben Johnson uses him in a way, and he was drafted 10th overall, anywhere remotely near how he used Laporta in his first year, could be the move. He's another mid to late round pick that, he could serve as a starter, maybe not right away, but likely by mid-season, if not sooner. And his upside is high for a 9th or 10th round pick in fantasy. And lastly, we get the Luther Burden. And I want to talk about the receivers a little bit in general. There's a few on this graphic here, at least. DJ Moore and Rome Odunze aren't rookies, and DJ has at least shown some production. And Rome is very talented, so there's a lot of reason to believe that his second year will be his breakout year. He'll be worth way above his wide receiver, 35 ADP. But this receiving room is still up in the air. And so taking a flyer in one of the cheaper players there is just a really easy decision to justify. Luther Burden is talented, and there's a lot of talk about him possibly earning the slot role there at some point. Again, even if not by midseason, which is, like we talked about in this podcast already, a means to high production very easily. And don't get me wrong, he's not a guarantee to have any production at all this year, but in those late, 12th, 13th rounds, when you're looking for guys that can wildly outperform their ADP, a cheap, talented receiver, kind of an ambiguous receiving room is usually a pretty good pick. And honestly, I'd rather have him than some of the guys going around him, like Jaden Higgins, Marvin Mims. Scroll here: Josh Palmer, Xavier Legette, DeAndre Hopkins. I don't think those guys have as much upside as Burden offers. Even this year, the 2026 fantasy year, I don't think those guys have as much upside as he does. So overall, I think the range of outcomes for honestly any of the Bears players on this chart is really good. And the folks out there that running the crazy Monte Carlo simulations on the season and running 10,000 sims and all that, they're finding pretty large standard deviations for these guys. But I think that's exactly who you bet on in later rounds. So I might not be as in on DJ Moore, or I think Rome's a decent pick. But these later guys, if we're looking at a lot of variation in your late rounds, you don't want someone in your 12th round who's going to give you a 10th round return. You want someone in your 12th round that's going to give you that 4th or 5th round return. So the guys highlighted here are definitely targets for me here.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. You got to lean into that uncertainty, especially, like you said, in a Ben Johnson offense. Will, do you have anything to add here before we finish things up?
I would just add that I completely agree. I think guys like Luther Burden, Colston Loveland, it's more of a matter of when than a matter of if. I think, with only having to overcome Olamide Zaccheaus, I think Luther Burden will be out there on the field at some point this season. And I think, Colston Loveland, the team's already shown they love him. It's just a matter of him working his way out there more. So I think, like you said, there's a lot of upside to be had with this offense, especially with Ben Johnson at the helm. So I'm excited to see what he can bring in year one. And I think this is going to be one of those situations that, as the season goes on, things get better. I know things have been scary coming out of camp as of the moment, but I think they'll really start to gel as, the season starts rolling and things really start going.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We got animals all up on this podcast. My cat's trying to get in it, but let's round this thing out. I think that we gave you guys some that's the wrong screen. I think that we gave you guys some very valuable information. So if you guys enjoyed, please do leave a like on the video and hit that subscribe button. That would be greatly appreciated. We talked about these 6 offenses that we think can win you leagues. And if you have something to add, something to comment, a team that we missed, please do drop it down in the comments below. But yeah, I think that's all I got. Do you guys have anything to add before we peace out here?
No, sir.
We're gonna do this every episode, aren't we?
I think we are. It's pretty fun for me watching y'all squirm. But that's gonna do it. I'll end it for
I'm gonna come
y'all.
up with something next time.
Love to hear it. Ooh, join the Discord if you guys want to. We're always talking fantasy. We've been popping off in there as of late. So join the Discord and the link in the description. But that'll do it. We appreciate you guys as always, and we'll catch you in the next one. Peace.
Peace.